Welcome to the Inspired Evolution, and it is such a treat to be here today. Today I have the blessing to be here with Eric Edmeades. Eric, how are you, brother?
I'm good. Glad to be here.
It is such a treat to have you here. For those tuning in for the first time, Eric is a serial entrepreneur, an international business speaker, author, and a husband and a father, right? And so this is going to take a minute because Eric has his fingers in many pies, let's put it that way. He's a true serial entrepreneur. He spent the last 20 years starting, buying, selling, turning around businesses in over 6 countries. He's owned businesses in data capture, field service, wireless networking, events management, high fidelity medical simulation, and even Hollywood special effects, right? That is so diverse. I can't wait to jump into this conversation. Eric's logged over 10,000 hours on stage and spoken over 20 different countries around the world. He routinely speaks at business, marketing, technology conferences, film festivals, corporate engagements, does pro bono talks. And the real reason why he's here is because he's widely regarded as one of the most effective business and personal mentors in the world, right? His life is a reflection of the results he creates for others. A longtime student of extraordinary living, as Eric puts it, he's extremely good at both inspiring and empowering people to live compelling, enjoyable, and rewarding lives. He's a champion of healthcare and self-care. He's one of he was a true pioneer. He created this thing called WildFit. He's passionate about helping people, and in particular children, the future generation, achieve and experience outstanding health. In 1991, Eric experienced his own dramatic health recovery, which undertook years of research into fields of human health, evolutionary biology, human history. Today, he's passionate about helping people achieve a vibrant health and inspiring people to take responsibility for their own self-care. And then most importantly, right, he's a dedicated father and a husband. He's had some really good chats with his son, who's now in university in Canada. And I just can't wait to dive into this conversation.
It's going to be fun.
So I think I usually like to start it quite lighthearted and not, but now that you're here, it's just extraordinary living. Because this was a really tough conversation to prepare for. There's WildFit, there's the Speakers Academy, there's the multifaceted different businesses that you've put your fingers in. And there is a conversation I'm looking forward to having on stress, because I know that's a big thing. And you've got a really interesting philosophy on that, and I have one too. But extraordinary living, what does that mean to you? And what I think fundamentally I would like to sort of draw into the conversation is the context of your life. Like, why has your life been the artwork that you've sort of used as the canvas to demonstrate what extraordinary living is?
I think even now, there's a lot of people who live lives that are about survival. They're about, waking up in the morning, going to do a job that they don't really like in order to pay rent for a house or apartment that they're not all that thrilled with, in order to keep, some semblance of safety or survival in their life. And I really, I see all these people struggling to find their life's purpose and their life's mission. And what I would suggest is I think that everyone's life purpose should first of all be the same, and that is to enjoy it. It's that simple like that. Just the first thing should be about enjoying it.
Yeah.
And then once you kind of, at least in my world, once I kind of tapped into that, then it just became a question of evaluating the decisions I needed to make on what was going to create maximum enjoyment. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't mean in this kind of hedonistic at all costs. Mm-hmm. I mean that you have to look at the timeline and say what's going to be most enjoyable. Having children is a really good example. I often talk to people about the decision-making process, and I use the decision to have children as an example of how it works. And the way it works is that you see yourself in the present. I'm here in this moment, and I have a choice: have a baby, don't have a baby. Uh-huh. And the way most people create decision fatigue for themselves is that they create, the steps are, you create an imaginary future where you don't have the baby. Yeah. And then you create an imaginary future where you do have the baby. So the first thing is to accept that those futures are both imaginary. You have no idea. Yeah. And as a parent, I can say that people who don't have children literally have no idea what they're imagining.
I bet.
And so then what has to happen is you have to imagine those two timelines and then compare them against each other. Yeah. So, for example, if a man and a woman are sitting discussing whether to have a child or not, well, over the next hour or so, having a child seems like a lot of fun. But, 9 months later, it's going to be a very different situation. And then a year later, and then 30 years later. Mm. And a lot of people don't think about that. When my wife and I were talking about it, one of the things we talked about is, what did we want our life to be like when we were in our 70s, 80s, and so on. And having children around at that stage was actually really important to us. And that's a fascinating thought process. It's not just about the having little versions of you and me running around kind of conversation. It's the, what's it going to be like over our lifespan? But what most people are doing is comparing the time, they're taking these two fantasy futures and they're comparing the time frames, and they're going, well, it'll be fun right now. Okay, well, it won't be fun in a year. And it'll be, and yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And my simple thing is, over the span of your life, which one is going to create most enjoyment? And enjoyment's an important word. Enjoyment doesn't mean easy. Enjoyment doesn't mean that you love it all. Enjoyment doesn't mean that you're happy all the time. Kids are, again, such a good example for this, because I always tell people, all children are going to do is expand the emotional experience you have. They're going to give you lows like you've never had before, but they're going to give you highs like you've never had before. And I think of the word enjoy as differently. I don't mean enjoy means it's all good. I mean enjoy means enjoy the deliciousness of it, one way or the other. You know, in the same way, it's like it's kind of a silly example, but you know, if somebody's in a car accident, they enjoy the benefits of their car insurance. I mean, enjoy. What it means is to appreciate, right? And so, you know, when somebody goes through a really terrible breakup, what kind of music do they put on?
Sad music.
Why? Because they're enjoying it.
Speaks to a part of them.
They're enjoying the deliciousness of the intensity of that emotion in that moment. And so extraordinary living to me is finding a way to enjoy, to appreciate, to have gratitude for the complete emotional range of experience you're having.
Yeah. So for me, the thing that's really exciting is that, you know, you've created many different ventures and many different things that you, like I said before, your fingers are in many different pies. So when you talk about this, it's not just something like, people have many philosophies that are saying, you know, live a life that's rich as a tapestry and your lows do give you your highs. But knowing that you've invested and started different businesses, you help people, like you transform people through speaking and their health and fitness, people go through drastic lows and drastic highs. And you're at the nexus of a lot of this, or holding space for a lot of this. And I find that context really potent. At what point did you realize that this was going to be the trajectory for you? Like, were you always geared a certain way to, like, want to live an extraordinary life, as you call it, like full of enjoyment? Or was there something that was a catalyst? I
think my mom would tell you that I was like a happy kid, you know, like that I was generally a happy kid. So I was generally a bliss seeker. I was generally a hedonist. I would want to do that which was fun. And I think that I had a lot of that. But the other side of it is I grew up, you know, I had a tough upbringing. My dad was an alcoholic and my parents divorced when I was young. You know, I mean, how many of us have that story? And I think one of the things that did for me is it made me recognize that my safety, my happiness, my security was actually up to me. You know, even from a young age, even from 6, 7, 8 years old, I was like, well, it's kind of up to me. Right. And I think that's one of the lessons that's often lost on people these days. They genuinely believe that their happiness is external. And even when they can read all the books and they can listen to motivational speakers and they can theoretically understand the idea that it isn't. But the fact is they wait for external things to drive their happiness. Yeah. And I think that because of the way I grew up, maybe there was a part of me that was, geared toward chasing my happiness. Like one of the things I like, is it in the American Declaration of Independence where it says that, all people are equal, but there's that bit where it says that people have the right to pursue happiness. Yeah. You know, I lived in England for 10 years and I'll tell you, one of the big differences between Americans and English people in massive stereotypical terms is that on the whole, English people think that their happiness is up to the government. It's up to the weather. It's up to society. It's up to external stuff. I mean, you tell your English friend that you're going off on vacation to, the Maldives for 2 weeks and they go, oh, really? It's all right for some people. Right? In America, they were told from the beginning, you have the right to pursue happiness. Right. We're not guaranteeing it to you. You got to go get it. Yeah. And I think that because of the way I grew up, I had a little bit of that understanding that my happiness was ultimately going to be up to me.
So there's a lot of self-responsibility in that you've addressed, but also I'm intrigued by what do you think was, or what is your takeaway in terms of staying dedicated to that path of happiness?
Well, it's really simple. Avoid pain. Like I'll give you a really great example. I made one of the classic entrepreneurial mistakes where I built up a company, I sold it, and I had enough cash that if I lived wisely and invested fairly well, I mean, nothing fancy, I probably could have lived for the rest of my life without having to worry about money. And then, one day I was offered this opportunity to buy a company. So I took most of my money and bought that company. And this is a typical entrepreneur mistake, is take this massive financial security that you've created and then risk it
again.
And so I did that, and it turned out to be a terrible risk. It turned out to be a terrible decision on paper. In the scope of my life, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. But it took time for it to be seen that way. And so here we were owning this company that the owners previous to us had used it for investment scam after investment scam after investment scam, because it had been a part of Industrial Light and Magic. It had been part of Lucasfilm. And so it was very sexy. Yeah. And so the previous owners had played a lot of games inside it. And so by the time I took ownership of it, I was immediately slammed with a bunch of lawsuits and there were all kinds of technological claims that the owners had made that turned out not to be true. And so I was left with this situation where I'd invested my nest egg, my security in this company. And I was going to lose it all.
Sure.
And we were quite literally week by week by week facing the reality of losing the company. Every week we'd have a difficult time with payroll or workers' compensation or union fees or whatever it was that we were struggling with. And every single week there was something threatening that you're going to lose the business and that everybody's going to lose their jobs and that I was going to lose all the investment that I put into it. And I remember at one stage, my wife and I were at home and we're walking along down the beach and we're like, we're not happy. We're not happy because I have taken this massive risk and it's turned out to be a bad risk. And all of a sudden, the financial security that we created for ourselves was gone. And our best case scenario was we were going to lose all our money and that we might somehow be able to preserve the jobs of the people in this company. That's the best case scenario. And week by week, it didn't look like we were going to preserve their jobs. And so we were walking along and I turned to my wife at one point and I said, I can't do this. My happiness is not about that. Like, look around us right now. Look at the way the waves are curling in on the sand right now. I mean, that is gorgeous. Look, smell the air around us. That's amazing. And so my happiness can't be about this one thing that isn't going correctly right now. And so I said, maybe what we need to do is we need to look at the worst case scenario. I said, what's the worst thing that could happen? And so we played it out. The worst thing that could happen is that we'd lose the business. We'd lose all our investment. All those people would lose their jobs. We would go back to our home. We owned a house in Turks and Caicos at the time, mortgaged. So it's not like we owned it, like it was still going to be stressful. And my wife at that point did have a job, and we took a look at the budget and we said, okay, God, we could go from being really quite wealthy to living on her salary. Could we make that work? We did a budget. We were like, okay, worst case scenario, we could make that work. And so I'm like, okay, so worst case scenario is we go home and we start all over again. We're not going to be at the soup kitchen. As Wayne Dyer put it, if it gets really, really terrible, you can just go to Safeway, go to a grocery store, and you can always steal grapes, just quietly, Well, we weren't even going to have to use that plan. We were just going to go home and start again. And as soon as we realized that rock bottom was livable, and in our world, most of us live in countries where rock bottom is livable.
It's better than most other places.
And so once we got to that, we suddenly are like, all right, well, with that in mind, let's just be happy. Let's just be happy. Let's not care about all that. Let's just be happy. And I'll tell you, look, we can get into the metaphysics of this. Like, we did it. We truly got happy. We started, we went out for dinner and we started cooking for ourselves and enjoying our company and, enjoying each other, and just, we got back to being happy. And then about a month and a half later, all of a sudden we get this phone call from one of the studios and we landed Pirates of the Caribbean. And then we landed Elysium. And then we landed a couple of other movies. And so suddenly our studio that was really struggling, bam, 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 we landed all this business. Now here's the tough part. My metaphysical friends want to tell me that the reason that happened is that I was wearing the right crystals and I was burning the right incense, and it was because I found happiness. And as a result of that happiness, I sent a signal out into the universe, and now the universe is delivering through law of attraction. Or that stuff was going to happen anyway. But thank God we found happiness first, because if we had not, then we would have been upset, depressed, sad, whatever. And then we would have started winning these deals. And then we would have found happiness, and it would have reinforced the idea that our happiness was driven by the external.
Yeah, wow.
So whichever it is, I don't really care. The fact is we found happiness.
And you got the lessons the way that they were meant to arrive to enrich your life the way that they have. That's amazing. So I know this is probably just one story out of many that you've failed tribulation through. And I think I want to use this as a gateway to sort of jump into stress, because in this conversation you'll quickly realize you've got an evolutionary view on what stress is all about. And I'm a big fan of stress, especially just like working with people and trying to help them evolve. I feel like stress is incredible because it's something that invariably is nature's signal to them going, hey, you're not doing what you're meant to be doing, Ruster, or you're not looking after yourself, you know what I mean? And people have this adverse relationship with stress. They hate it. And it's like, trying to avoid it. But it's like, it's actually your life communicating to you via stress. And I know that you have a position on stress as well, and what that actually means for you in terms of almost Darwinian natural selection, right?
Well, let's back up for a minute. One of the challenges with language is that there are only so many words, and there are far more definitions than words, right? So there are a limited pool of words and an unlimited pool of definitions. And so, for example, when we say something like, is meat good or bad? Yes, it can be good and bad, and so the one word is not really sufficient to discuss what that thing is. And, I think the same thing is true with stress. That we think of stress, and immediately most people, when you talk about stress, they think of negative stress. They think of being stressed about their life, or feeling unsafe, or this negative stress. What I would suggest is what we have to do is look at what stress really is, and stress is it means that things are challenging. So, but it can be positive stress, it can be negative stress, and so when somebody has short-term positive stress, I think it's incredibly valuable. I mean, I was reading a little while ago, speaking of, sort of Darwinian principles, that when somebody has really intense short-term stress, one of the things that's fascinating is that, we have two primary fuel sources. We burn sugar, which is not the ideal fuel source for living. And then we burn fat, which is really a great fuel source for living. We also can burn protein.
Yeah.
And so what happens when we have really powerful short-term stress is that there's a process that starts to happen in the liver where we actually start breaking down proteins and we start burning that protein. But I think what also happens during that time, at least according to this article I was reading, is that at that stage, the body actually, when it's burning those proteins, it's choosing to burn the least functional ones. And so it's actually, that short-term stress is actually acting like this cleaning system for cells that might need to be out anyway.
It's bordering on a cleanse.
Exactly. So it's like stimulating a cleanse in a sense. And then, which is interesting because even with really positive short-term stress, somebody can find themselves having a little bit of a cold afterward or feeling a little bit run down. Yeah, the body's just gone through this maybe a bit of an elimination process. So short-term stress, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. And in fact, I think short-term stress can create some of the very best learning ever. We've just finished our speaking academy here. I will tell you, it's one of the most effective tools for transformation I've ever seen. Maybe it seems a bit, self-serving for me to say that about my own program. I will tell you, during this program, this time here in Thailand, there were two women that were so stressed that on day 3 or 4 of the program, they're basically like rebelling. They're like, one of them was like outwardly angry with me about it. Like the way you've done this and the way you've done this. Because one of the things is really intense practice, but that practice is designed to induce some stress because in that stress, it's going to activate clearer thinking, clearer learning. And true to form, both of them have come out and said it was the best thing ever. and that's sometimes how stress is in the short term. When people ask me to talk about stress, it's usually because they've seen me talking on YouTube about it or something like that. And in that case, I'm generally talking about pervasive long-term stress. And I believe that's one of the most dangerous things that people can have is pervasive long-term stress, where they are allowing the conditions of their life to cause a pervasive sense that they're under threat. And the reason being is that when they are like that, they are producing a constant flow of cortisol and adrenaline and their immune system's being depressed. And so, when people are under that kind of stress, they're far more likely to get sick. They're far more, I think they're shortening their life when they do that. And there's a raft of research that suggests that's true. I saw somebody recently, on one of my videos, somebody commented that this has all been, rebutted. It's been proven that stress doesn't shorten people's lives. I'm like, wow, they were saying that the only time stress shortens your life is when you're under stress. I don't really, or it was even worse than that. They were saying that the only time stress will shorten your life is when you believe that stress will shorten your life. Well, yeah, that's because that would be stressful.
That is such a mind gamble. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I, one of my favorite examples of this is, it's really simple, but if you look at chimpanzees, and let's not mistake how closely related we are to chimpanzees. I mean, you have chimpanzees and you have bonobos, and they are very, very closely related, and we share more DNA with the one than the other one does.
Yeah.
So I think there's some, lessons that we might be able to draw there. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that when you have a troop of chimpanzees, they groom each other. You've seen it. They pick nits out of each other and they groom each other. But there's some interesting stuff. You only groom a chimpanzee that's senior in social rank to you.
Oh.
It's just the way that works. You only groom the chimps that are senior in social rank to you, which means that the lowest ranking chimpanzees, nobody's grooming them.
Right.
Well, that's interesting because when they're being groomed, it reduces their stress hormones and increases their pleasure and relaxation hormones. When they're not being groomed, there's nothing doing. It's like, so the chimpanzees at the lowest rank, nobody's grooming them.
Sure.
So there's nothing like reducing their stress hormones, and there's nothing, they're not producing lots of oxytocin and gorgeous stuff.
Yeah.
And guess what? In the troop, they have the shortest lifespans.
Right.
And frankly, I believe it's sort of a Darwinian principle of if you're the lowest ranking member of the clan, well, it's probably for a reason. Sure. It's been because you're not as effective a hunter, or you're not as effective a parent, or you're not as effective a communicator, or whatever the case may be. And so if you're not as effective, then in a Darwinian sense, we don't really want you having children. And so I think that was nature's way of saying, well, if you're the lowest ranking in the social order of things, it's best that we don't have you using up the resources and so stress kills. And so I think that where that has become dangerous for us is that our world, we've flipped a whole lot of stuff. There's this principle I've been writing about recently called the evolution gap.
Yeah.
I really fundamentally believe that most of the unhappiness and difficulty that people suffer in their lives today stems from one thing, and that is that our physiology and our psychology evolved for a certain lifestyle, and that lifestyle was sub-Saharan Africa. And our pace of change in society happened so quickly that our psychology and our physiology didn't keep up with that.
Yeah.
And so today we've switched things. The most successful members of our society are often the most stressed out. And that's why there's they're walking along in the hallway one day and they have such a coronary event that they're dead before they hit the floor.
Yeah, the environment that we live in now is not the environment that biologically we're set up to be in, which is so fascinating. You've traveled quite a bit to experience a lot of these. You've traveled to Africa. You've seen a lot.
Well, I was born there. That was my first travel to Africa.
Tell me more about that. Whereabouts were you born?
I was born in South Africa. My family's been in South Africa. I mean, if I understand the family history well enough, my great however many times back grandmother was the first white woman born north of the Orange River in sub-Saharan Africa as like early settlers to South Africa.
Yeah. Wow. Incredible. Incredible. So the thing that really struck me was your curiosity in that. Like, obviously we discussed a lot about stress, but the way you've dived all the way in, even to the metaphysical, and then also the understanding of what stress does in your body, right? And before that, we were just talking about happiness and your relationship with the world. At what point do these ideas start to crystallize for you as becoming a message that you're going to share? Like,
okay, in the strangest sense, as a kid, in the strangest sense, 13, 14, 15 years old, as much as I could not figure out girls for the life of me, like I was the worst, but I could for everybody else. So like my friends, when they were having relationship strife, they would come to me and say, oh, but I think this and she says that or whatever. And I was always the one that could bring them back together. I was always the one who could create that. I was good at conflict resolution and helping friends come together or helping people, meet the one they wanted. Like I just had a thing about that. So in a real sense, I was sort of coaching as a kid, even though I had no idea how to make it work for me in my life. People would come to me and had these problems, and I never really noticed that. It's not something I really thought a great deal about. But there was an event some years ago where my wife and I were at a workshop, and there was a woman there who had been, she'd been suicidal, and I ended up having a conversation with her. And I'm curious about suicide. I'm curious about what, drives a person to that point. And I'm also curious about the difference between men and women in suicide. It's like men typically kill themselves and women make several attempts often. And so, when I met this woman, I sort of was asking her a little bit about her process and how she knew she wanted to kill herself and why. And we ended up having this really deep breakthrough conversation. And what I didn't realize is that my wife was there for the conversation. Like I was just meeting this woman in the hallway, and we just started having this conversation. And then there was a group of people gathering around. And I was so focused on my conversation with this woman that I didn't notice the group of people gathered around. And she and I had a really deep conversation, and then we went our separate ways. And the next day, my wife ended up having lunch with her. And the woman said to my wife that, we were at a workshop. It was actually a Tony Robbins workshop. And she said, wow, this workshop's really helped me out. Tony's really helped me. And she used her hands to gesture that her life had been lifted to a point. But she said, but then I met this guy in the hallway yesterday. And he just asked me some questions, and he just said some things. And then she lifted her hand like really high up, and she goes, and that took me to this new place where I'm going to be living a different life. And, her issue was that she'd been born with some really difficult birth defects, and she'd been having surgeries and surgeries and surgeries. And she'd had this goal of like wanting to move off to Thailand, and she'd never had a boyfriend. And 6 months later, she's in Thailand and she's teaching English and she has a boyfriend. And so my wife at that point said to me, we have to get you out into the world. I'm like, I'm running my company over here.
Yeah.
And she goes, no. She says, there's something you've got to get it out there. You've got to take it out in the world. And really that was the first time that I really thought to myself, yeah, I do. I have a message beyond running companies. I can run a company and I can impact the lives of my employees and the lives of my customers, but maybe I want to do something bigger. And it really, I think it stemmed from that conversation. And frankly, from my wife saying, wow, I see you in a way you can't see you. And I think, frankly, I think that's one of the jobs that our significant partners are supposed to have in our lives is to see the magnificence in us that we can't see. Unfortunately, I think many people have partners that can see the minutia of imperfections
the more the
better than they can the magnificence.
Yeah, there's that age-old saying, right, behind every successful man is an incredible woman as well, and that vision is a big part of the feminine aspect of things as well. I'm really inspired by that. So how long has it been since you decided to take yourself and your message on the road and sharing it with people? Properly
now, about 5 years. Yeah. Properly now. I mean, I've done speaking in the past. When I sold my first company, I just started traveling around the world, and I did a 2-year speaking tour where I spoke in about 20 countries about business, and just that was a lot of fun. And that's probably what woke me up to and helped me develop a lot of the skills and what have you to really wake me up to this possibility. But then I got back into the business world for a long time. And, another big change that came along is I got a random phone call out of the blue one day asking me if I would come and teach business and marketing at Tony Robbins' business mastery programs. And as he'd had a massive impact on me in my late teens. I was listening to him on, tapes. I know. It's a long
what
time
are those?
ago. I know. Your generation doesn't understand. But I was listening to him in the car on cassette tapes at 17, 18, 19 years old. And so to get this phone call was, pretty fascinating. And then to spend the next year and a half speaking at his events and spending a lot of time with him, I think that also really turned me on to want to do more of it. And so that happened about 5 or 6 years ago. And after that, I sat down with my wife and said, look, what do we really want to do in the world? And at that point, I realized that there were two big things. The one is that I had a unique set of skills and I had some special knowledge around how to help people transform their health, just because of what I'd gone through as a kid and the research that I'd done. And I wanted to find a way to take those skills and take that knowledge and actually create change. I didn't want to create just another diet that, would like prescribe a set of rules and that people would follow those rules under some stringent willpower that they would lose track of within 45 minutes or maximum a few days. And that's traditionally how the diet industry works. And so we sat down and said, well, how could we actually affect change in people? Like, where they really got it. And then at the same time, we were like, and who ultimately do we want to change? Because there's a whole planet of people, right? So who, and not just from a marketing perspective, but more from an influence perspective. And I made the decision at that point that if I was going to spend a huge amount of time and devote my life toward having a big impact, that the average person on the street was not where I wanted to go, and politicians was not where I wanted to go. I felt like if I, for example, was really able to empower people to improve their health and have more money and have more time in their life, if I do that for the average citizen, they just buy a bigger TV and spend more time watching it. If I do that for politicians, well, frankly, I know some politicians and I love them and I understand their passion. And the fact is that with rare exception, when you're talking about people that are, say, in Congress or in Parliament, they spend this huge amount of effort getting their job. Then they get their job for 4 years. And then they spend the last 2 years of that 4 years trying to re-get their job. It just is not an efficient system. And so I didn't want to play in that arena. But I did find an arena that I thought was really fascinating, and that was business. Like what happened in my life was when I built my first company, after about 5 or 6 years, I didn't have to go to work anymore. Like my company ran so smoothly, I didn't have to be there, and I became bored.
Yep.
And I think what the planet needs right now is bored entrepreneurs. It needs entrepreneurial people who are bored silly with their companies so that they'll start another company, or they'll take on a social project, or that they'll take their company to another level. And the challenge is that most entrepreneurs are not bored, they're stressed. And they're stressed solving problems that have already been solved. And so I was like, what if I went and solved those problems for them so that they could apply their creativity and optimism to real issues, like how to reduce the amount of plastic that is flowing into our oceans, or how to improve air quality, or how to make sure that women have rights. I mean, I've traveled extensively around East Africa. The way women are treated in that part of the world is deplorable, and that's not even the worst of what we face. Yeah. So if I could help entrepreneurs become bored with their businesses, wouldn't they then potentially turn their creativity and optimism to fixing some of the world's great problems?
Yo, that's quite a lever that you found. That's like the biggest change makers, and enabling them to free up their time to make the change and the impact further. That is quite the... Yeah, I don't even know what the metaphor for that is, but that is amazing.
It was just a matter of taking a look at saying, hey, if I help one entrepreneur, then the immediate thing to recognize is that they have all their employees, and it's going to spread down through them. But then beyond that, when they've made their business operate, they're going to grow it, and they're going to create more employment, and they're going to pay more taxes, or they're going to take on social projects. So at that point, my wife and I took a look and said, then we have two big missions here. One is about self-care, and the other one is about entrepreneurship. And so we created the Business Freedom Academy and started teaching entrepreneurship.
Right.
And we created WildFit and started teaching our entrepreneurs how to maximize their energy, their cognition, their sleep, and what have you for business. And that's what gave birth to WildFit.
That makes a lot of sense now, how those two things are coupled. So I want to ask you, because there's obviously there's not a split between the two. Now we've obviously formed why they're connected, but what is the message in your heart that you're most passionate about to share?
You know, I think it really comes down to life is short, and have the most fun that you can. Like, have the most fun you can. We tend not to regret the things we did do. We tend to regret the things we didn't do. And, you know, because you do something, and even when it has a negative consequence, you grow spiritually and you become a better. I mean, how many things have happened in your life, or in the life of anybody who's listening right now, where at the time it was deplorable, at the time it was painful, at the time it was regretful, and then in the benefit of time, you look back at it and go, geez, I'm really glad I did that. I'm really glad I went through that.
Medicine.
Exactly. And, you know, so one of the concepts that we speak a lot about at our workshops, and I have a book that I'm working on about this, is called the Hindsight Window. And the Hindsight Window is the period of time between a bad event taking place, bad in quotes, obviously, taking place, and the day that you reconcile it, that you recognize it as brilliance, that you recognize it as one note in the symphony of an otherwise amazing and outstanding, extraordinary life. The trouble is that or at least my feeling is that the longer somebody's hindsight window is, the less fundamentally happy they are as a human being. In other words, they had a bad event happen 5 years ago, and if they're still dwelling on it, then it's affecting their happiness on a day-by-day basis. Whereas if they can find a way to close that window sooner, then they're going to experience a much higher average degree of happiness in their life.
Makes a lot of sense.
Right to the point that what if, and this is the holy grail, but what if they could get to a point where as soon as something was happening that was quote unquote bad, what if they could in that moment see it as brilliance? What if they could in that moment see that bad event and go, wow, this is unpleasant. Man, am I having an opportunity to learn right now.
Find gratitude for that in that moment.
Find the gratitude then, instead of having to wait until the memory is dulled or 2 years have passed.
Yeah. Love that message. Super potent. Comes back to staying in the present, staying with the now, and like really like availing yourself to the opportunities that are in the present moment. Super potent. So we've discussed our relationship with ourselves. How do you feel the tapestry of time and everything, like with everybody else? Can I go there in the conversation?
Absolutely.
So like, obviously there's the hindsight window for myself, and like the moments that I have, and the closer I draw that in with myself, there's almost like that quantum relationship between healing myself in the present moment, rather than going out into the future, waiting 5 years to go back and look back and be like, yeah, I should heal this way. What about how we're all interconnected, and the hindsight window of where we're all going? You know, in terms of how we're all interconnected. Is there any space for that?
You know, I think this illusion of separation, you know, I think it serves a purpose. You know, I have this sort of weird metaphor for the way I view life, and maybe it comes from playing too many video games as a kid. Or it might come from that at 15 years old, I was homeless. And one of the ways I got myself off the streets was I negotiated a deal that let me live in a video arcade.
Uh-huh.
So I have my video game theory of life. And it works kind of like this, that let's imagine that when we're not here experiencing this life, you know, everybody has their theory about afterlife or before life and reincarnation and, you know, heaven and hell and so on. Sure. But let's just leave all the labels out. And let's say, what if when we're not having this physical life, there is some form of non-physical spiritual life? Now, if that were true, it must be awfully interesting and blissful initially to be alleviated out of the pain and suffering and the stress of living and be in this glorious, fully connected spiritual existence with no curiosity of any kind, but equally no tension.
Sure.
You know, it would be very difficult you would never have hunger, and therefore food would never taste good. In fact, you wouldn't need to eat food because you're this non-physical spiritual being. Now, I'm thinking initially that might be really pleasant. It might be like just living in one great orgasm the whole time, just like in this incredible brilliance.
Yeah.
But then I think it would get boring.
Yeah.
And the minute it would get boring, you know, let's say you and I are in our non-physical form up there and we're so interconnected that we don't even have to have a conversation. But if we could have a conversation, it might go like this. Oh, I miss pizza. You know, I miss first kisses.
Yeah.
I miss sand between my toes walking on the beach. And I just wish I could live again. And then you're like, dude, remember what it's like to have a credit card to pay? Like, you know, in dental, do you remember what it's like to go to the dentist? And go, yeah, but right now I'm so empty of feeling that I would like to go to the dentist.
Yeah.
I would like to feel the passion of jealousy. I would like to feel the passion of anger. I would love to feel the early throes of love. I want to have that full deliciousness of physical experience.
Yeah.
And so then I would, you know, we might go and talk to the person who controls whether we get to have this life. And we go, listen, I want to go back down to earth and I want to have a life. And they go, all right, you can, but here's what you need to know. In order for you to fully experience the jeopardy of life, I'm going to have to create for you a full on and complete illusion of separation and a complete illusion of mortality. I'm going to have you believe that if you are suffering, that suffering is real. That if you if your life is under threat, that you are under threat. The illusion is going to have to be absolutely complete in order for you to get the full deliciousness of the moment, which means that you are going to suffer real pain at times. Do you still want to go down there? And I think we opt in. I think we say yes. And so we come down into this illusion of separation because that is where our spiritual growth is, that we have to feel separate and that we have to feel pain. And food tastes its very best when you're at your most hungry.
Yeah, so true.
And so we have to have that experience. And so then we come down here and we go into this, you know, we start experimenting with the spiritual and we start going, oh, aren't we really one? And even as we acknowledge our oneness, we go, yeah, but we're still separate. I mean, if we're going to eat this here food, there's only, you know, it's going to get divided. We're not going to, you know, there. And I think that's kind of how it is that we're supposed to come together and we're constantly going to be reminded that we're not.
I love that. I sometimes wonder, and this is getting super metaphysical now, but if we already, like you said, decide to choose the lessons that we come to learn in that emotional state.
I wonder about that. Like, here's a great example. You know, you hear people say, this is sort of silly metaphysics now, but you know, people say,
we're freeing in a conversation.
This person's a really old soul. You know, the metaphor, this really old soul.
I still don't know what that means. But...
I think I know.
Yeah?
I think I've got it.
Tell me.
Haven't you ever met somebody where it's absolutely clear that they don't understand the rules? Like, they come down into earth and they come into their life and they just get it wrong in every possible way.
Yeah.
And then I think of it this way, that if you were brand new at the video game of life, what kind of life would you choose? You would choose the one that appeared to be the easiest.
The safe.
You'd be like, oh, I want to be a rock star. I'd like to be a major politician, leader of the free world. Like, you know, there are some that would argue that we currently have a politician in charge of one country who clearly is on Earth for the very first time.
No points for guessing who that is.
But then every now and again you meet somebody and you're like, wow, they're an old soul. So what maybe it is a bit like that. Maybe you come down and you go, God, you know, I've never played the game before. Oh my God, Rockstar looks really cool. And that's why so many of them are dead at 27.
Yo.
because they come in here and they don't understand the rules, and they don't understand that happiness is internal.
Yeah.
And so they seek drugs and alcohol as rather than seeking, I mean, look, people have their opinions of how to use those things. I choose not to drink. I don't have any judgment about it. There's definitely the difference between somebody who has alcohol as something they enjoy in the moment and somebody who's drowning their life in it.
Yeah.
And so, these people come in but maybe once you've been here 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 600,000 times, maybe one time you come down and go, I wonder what it's like to be a 7-year-old child that's dying from leukemia. I wonder what that'd be like. And maybe we opt in for that journey. And I have no idea. But sometimes it helps me sleep at night better, thinking that maybe it's on some level like that. That maybe on some level we come down in this life and we choose the spiritual journey we're supposed to be on. And in order for us to learn those lessons, the spiritual journey, the illusion has to be complete.
Yeah. Yeah. It ties back into what's ringing for me at the moment is a couple of things. Is before, when you were discussing the like we're sitting in heaven, I was or like in the interconnected state of everything. Heaven is just a word. There would be no music because there's no sorrow, there's no happiness. And then what we were just discussing about really for me was one of my favorite philosophers, Alan Watts. He talks about dreaming. And if you had the dream, like you knew that you could go into a dream and lucid dream, you would go out and you'd be like, sure, I'm going to dream the dream of the rock star, let's say, and have that dream and live the rock star life and have an amazing dream, wake up and be like, whoa, what a rush. And then down the track, it's like, okay, I'll get more curious about my dream. And eventually down the track, you would dream the dream that you're no longer dreaming. It's like, I want to see what that's like, 80 years of a life without a dream. And the lessons and the richness that comes from that, just driven by pure curiosity, which I see emanating from you in every way. The curiosity is an amazing thing. I'm at a juncture where I could ask you many things, but I really want to just rewind a little bit. And I've got this curiosity that, you touched on it really briefly. You said you exchanged your way to living in a video arcade, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's really interesting because look, if you're homeless and you're 15 years old and you're in Edmonton, Alberta, and it's winter, you find a way to get indoors. Like that, that was survival.
Crucial.
Survival. I'm curious because obviously success is a relative thing, but you're well thriving at the moment. I can touch wood, say that for yourself. There seems to be this thread of people going through lows, and then the lower the lows, almost the equivalent to highs, is kind of this thread in society. Touch wood for most people. I know there are some people that suffer quite a bit, but it seems to be that success often has this past where it's had some really character building traits to it. Can you share some of that on that?
I think that so when I was in school, maybe high school, I remember having an economics teacher, and what an interesting time that was. I remember observing my economics teacher coming to class in a 15-year-old Volvo, and I'm wondering why he was teaching me economics. It didn't seem like he'd necessarily mastered economics. Yeah. At 16, this was my narrow view of the world. Yeah. And then one day he was talking about a very famous entrepreneur from our part of the world in Eastern Canada called Casey Irving. And Casey Irving at that stage owned the largest chain of gas stations and the largest trucking company. And he was I believe a billionaire, and certainly a very, very high-end millionaire at the minimum. But then the thing that struck me out of that whole lesson, the thing that struck me out of everything we learned about that guy, was that he'd had something like 3 or 4 bankruptcies. And that made me realize that we often see the end result and we think that it was smooth sailing all the way. Mm-hmm. And it's really easy for us to do that. Yep. And the fact is, it's almost never like that. And, the old cliche, experience, how does that work? Good judgment comes from experience. Oh. But of course, experience comes from bad judgment. So what I think happens is that when we make decisions or when life triggers us to have these really low things, low experiences, that activates incredibly strong learning. At that moment when you're in pain, one of the things we talk about in our speaking academy is that one of the most tragic mistakes that speakers make is that they speak in facts all the time. They just lay off facts and without any emotion, those facts won't sink in. Emotion is the glue that causes a memory to stick. And so I think when we have a really painful situation, we have this heightened emotional experience, and that makes all the lessons from that time sink in really deeply.
Yeah.
In a way that if you were having a passive amount of pain, you might not really remember it.
Well, it's deep as well.
Yeah. And so I think that one of the reasons that people hit this kind of rock bottom and bounce really hard is they hit rock bottom, and it causes a couple of things. They're like, wow, I don't want that anymore. And the second thing is that the pain causes them to really look around and go, what do I need to be learning from this? What do I need to be learning from this? And so they take those lessons with them firmly, because they're embedded deeply in their subconscious because of the intensity of emotion they were having.
Right.
And I think the other thing that happens is, and this is really, maybe this is a little on the esoteric side, but the better it is, the better it is. And what I mean is that when you start to feel really abundant, you create more abundance.
Yeah.
If you think of it, here's one of my little metaphors. Beliefs are like little organisms, and they eat only one thing: evidence. That's all. A belief is just like a little organism, and it eats evidence. So if somebody has a belief that the world is harsh, that the world is pain, that the world is difficult, then that belief sits inside them and looks for evidence. And then it eats it. And it eats it. And the more it eats, the bigger the belief gets. And if it eats enough evidence, it's going to become a conviction, right? It's going to become like code in their being.
Yeah.
Conversely, if somebody has a belief that the world is full of opportunity, then they're going to be constantly looking around and going, oh, look, there's an opportunity. There's an opportunity. There's an opportunity. The belief's going to go, wow, there's opportunity. The world is opportunity.
Yeah.
And so I think that what happens sometimes when somebody has, let's say you have two people, and both of them go through some experiences, but one of them hits a rock bottom and the other one doesn't. Yeah. And then they both rise up to an equivalent place. The person who's hit rock bottom knows how good they've got it.
Yeah.
Right? They know how good they've got it. And that affects their beliefs. That affects their beliefs about how good it is. And so they're like, wow, life is incredible. Belief, life is incredible. Eating evidence, life is incredible. The other one didn't have this dip, and they're like, life's okay. They're at the same level. And so in a weird way, the dip causes an acceleration of manifestation, an acceleration of observation.
Amazing. Amazing. I love the way you grounded that in. That is so potent. And this touches me into the next point, which I really wanted to have a conversation with about, and I never would have let you go without having this chat. Storytelling, brother. Storytelling. I'm fascinated by it. Just to give you a short thing into it, I never really wanted to start a podcast, primarily because I had this thing against ego. For me, humility is a driving factor. And a lot of people that set up their own podcasts have this, I'm the expert, come listen to me, rah, rah, rah sort of vibe about it. But I found a groove in storytelling and finding people's stories and their operating systems and why and that sort of stuff. And it's a really beautiful place. And I love storytelling primarily because we could share your story now and I'll get something from it now. And I can listen to it 3 years down the track and I'll get a whole myriad of different things from it. And that's just me. And if someone else is listening, they'll get a different thing and we'll talk about it and we'll get something even further. I'm in awe of storytelling. I look at some of the old epics and how they've informed society as a collective as well. I know I'm a fan of your storytelling. Let's just put it that way. What is storytelling to you, and how has this been curated over time?
Well, let me back up to one thing.
Please.
This issue of podcasts, I just want to remind you of Napoleon Hill. Mm-hmm. And if you think about what Napoleon Hill did, is he was fascinated by success. And so what he did is he went out and collected stories.
Yeah.
He went out and he was the original podcaster.
Yeah.
What did he do? He went out and interviewed people that were getting the results. And so I think a podcast executed correctly is the antithesis of ego. It is the perpetual student. I don't have a podcast, but my team is pushing me to create one.
Yeah.
And they're asking me what we want to call it. And I said, I think we're going to call it the aspiring omnologist, because an omnology means like having a wide amount of knowledge about a vast number of things. And that's what I want to have. I'm just curious all the time. So if I create a podcast, it's not about necessarily me sharing my stories or my brilliance in any given situation. It's about me pulling it from others. So I just wanted to share that with you. And the way you interview, I've heard, I'm hearing you now, and I hear the way you do it. It comes from that place of exactly what you're talking about, pulling other people's stories.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just to, I know there's space for your response, but just yesterday I delivered a whole course here at Mind Value on people setting up their own podcasts. And it was incredible because it was driving people to find their own stories, find their own messages. And it was just the most incredible experience, just seeing all the stories there are in people that they're waiting to share.
Yeah.
And they're looking for a platform. And exactly what you shared was, I realized when Tony Robbins wrote his book, Awaken the Giant Within, he went and interviewed a whole bunch of people. It's hard once you start a podcast, and I was sharing this yesterday, to not write a book. Because
you collect so much information.
Your own thoughts get so crystallized, and you find yourself in amongst all these conversations again and again and again.
Yeah, and in so much as Napoleon Hill might have been the original podcaster, the truth is Tony Robbins was very seriously, and because Napoleon Hill didn't have the technology to be able to record and share. But Tony Robbins created a series back in the late 80s, early 90s called Power Talk, and all he did was interview the most incredible people on audio cassette tapes. Yeah. And I've listened to every one of them. That was really, truly, Tony Robbins was the original podcast.
Yeah, awesome.
So, but anyway, back to the storytelling issue. I view stories as the primary operating system or the primary operating language of the mind. And if you think about it, like the very best way for sapiens to learn, the best way for us to learn is by doing something. Because when we do something, we engage every sense we have in the process. And so we create a holistic memory of what we were doing. And the best way for us to learn is to do. And then the next best way for us to learn is to observe. So, when I've gone out to stay with the Hadza Bushmen, for example, you've got, 2 and 3-year-old children. Clearly they can't go hunting, so they can't learn by doing, but they can watch. They watch the men practice with their bows. And so I remember very distinctly this really sweet little 3-year-old Bushman child, a boy they made him a miniature bow, and he's watching the hunters practice with their bows. And so he starts doing it. So, the doing is the primary way. Watching is the next way. And in the absence of doing and watching, there's storytelling. Because what storytelling does is it creates memories that are almost the same as if you were doing or watching. In a very real sense, if a story is told properly, it should engage your senses. I could right now, I won't, but I could right now tell you a story that would make you salivate. You can't make yourself salivate right now. You can't do it. It's not a function. You can go, I think I'll just salivate. But I could tell a story that would speak to your nervous system and trigger salivation in you. Yeah. So storytelling has the same ability to write to the nervous system that doing and observing does. Yeah. And I think it's really important for us to remember that, BG, before Google, before Google, before Netflix, even before television, families used to sit around the radio, and all the radio was a substitute for the fire. We've had fire for arguably 1.4 million years. We've spent the vast majority of the 1.4 million years sitting around fires, sharing stories. And so storytelling is imperative to effective teaching. I do this all the time. I'll have an audience, a couple hundred, couple thousand people. I'll ask everybody in the room to raise their hand if they had at least one teacher that really mattered to them, that to this day, if they could go and have lunch with that teacher and thank them for their contribution to their life, would they, who has that teacher? And sadly, it's not everybody. It breaks my heart that it's not everybody, because if you think out of the 12 years that most people go to school and out of the plethora of teachers they have in each year, how is it they didn't even have one? But it's not everybody. And then I say, well, how many of you had one of those teachers and how many of you had 2? It's half. And how many had 3 or 4? It's even less. But then I say, but for those of you who did have one, was it a good storyteller? Was that teacher a good storyteller? Yep. Every time. And because, my grade 3 teacher was, Jan Kulczynski, and he was a brilliant storyteller. There are classes where I now could still teach you the class that he taught us. I could tell you the stories he told us, and because I still remember them. Because emotion is the glue that causes a lesson to stick, that causes a memory to stick. So storytelling is imperative in the teaching model, and it creates an unbelievable unfair advantage. This is one of the things that we really talk about a lot in our speaking academy, is that effective storytelling creates an unfair professional and business advantage because of this. Here's a thought. If we're sitting at the fire 100,000 years ago, and I share a story about how I survived a really scary situation. I was out hunting and these hyenas gathered around me and they were like hunting me. And I tell the story about how I dealt with it and how I saved my life. And I'm sitting around the fire telling you this story. And then a week later, you're out hunting and a couple hyenas start hassling you. And you remember what I did in my story and you do the same thing and it saves your life. Whose fire do you want to sit around for the rest of your life? That's why storytelling is so incredibly powerful, because the minute you give somebody a distinction that improves their quality of life, the minute you give somebody a distinction that saves them a huge amount of time or money or pain, then they want to keep coming back to you.
Right. Makes a lot of sense.
So it creates an unfair advantage. And I believe that that once somebody becomes an effective communicator like that, it spills over into every area of their life.
I just want to share in that, thank you so much for that, is that I'm really, really in awe of, through your art of storytelling and through the conversations we've been having, is there's a lot of big scale, like nature ideas, metaphysical ideas, philosophies, right? I'm in awe of how you ground them in. That was really awesome. Thank you so much for that. I think there's real medicine in that. So thank you for that. There's something that's been really curious, brimming for me, and I know we're kind of weaving our way out of this gently, but for me, words that activate. I've been noticing this recently. People will say certain words and, like you said, salivate, and then there'll be like a trigger in the nervous system. And I've been observing this more and more myself. Like, energy changes when people say certain words in a certain space. Is there any insight you can afford me with words and activation, or am I just being weird?
I think humans have, I think some of the most important work that Tony Robbins has done, at least in my opinion, some of the most important work, at least for me, was when he developed his, what he calls 6 human needs psychology.
Yep.
And I think it's really, really, I think it may be among the best work that he's done in terms of developing original content.
Yep.
I then also want to add to it that I actually believe that humans have 7 human needs.
Cool.
They have the 6 that Tony has demarcated, but then there's a 7th, and that 7th is primary. It's the first one, and it's more important than any of those 6, and that is the need for meaning. It is the need for meaning. At every juncture right now, you're going, what does that mean?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Right? Like this very moment, you're asking that question. It is the first question. If somebody were to walk in here with a gun, we immediately go, what would that mean? Right? It is the very first thing. And it is only once we've assessed a meaning that we can begin satisfying the other emotional needs. And so when you talk about words that have a charge for somebody, it's because they've attached a meaning to that word. And this is super fantastic in the world of political correctness at the moment. I was listening to Jordan Peterson, going through all this stuff in Canada around legislated use of gender flexible pronouns and all this kind of stuff. And then one of the interviewers was saying, well, frankly, we have to keep up with the times in political correctness. If this person was Asian, and he said, if you were to call me Oriental, I would be deeply offended. And I'm like, wow, I want to set my life up so that I'm unoffendable. Like I don't want to have a bunch of meaning about things you can say to me that would cause offense to me.
Makes sense.
And so I think that that's ultimately why we have that we have a charge on a word, is that we've given it some meaning.
Sure.
And man, we can improve our happiness when we realize that we're the ones that assess that meaning, even if society's trying to make us create that meaning. Because some years ago, Oriental wouldn't have caused a charge in a bunch of people, and now it does. And maybe there's good reason for it. I'll give you a funny little political correctness sidebar. Is that one of my ex-girlfriends, still a very good friend of mine today, Carrie, she said to me the other day, this is about a year ago, she said, she goes, the political correctness movement in Canada is just going too far. And I said, what do you mean? She goes, well, in Canada, you're no longer even supposed to address an immigrant as an immigrant. You're not even, you're an immigrant? Don't go to the line that says, immigrate. It'll say, you're now a new Canadian, right? Like, so I'm an immigrant, so I'm now a new Canadian. And to me, that's like, oh, come on. It's just a word. Like, why is that? Why do I have to put a meaning that So she goes, it's just going too far. She goes, for example, I can't even use the word Indian relative to myself anymore. And I go, well, hang on a minute. What do you mean? And then, of course, I forgot that her, I think, grandmother was a native Canadian, a pre-European Canadian, or whatever the correct political term, right?
It's so complicated.
So she goes, I can't even call myself an Indian. I go, well, why not? And I know why she shouldn't. And she goes, I go, why not? And she goes, well, because she has a status card, which means as a native Canadian, previously called an Indian because of Columbus not having any idea where he was. She said that means that she has a status card, which meant she could go live on what we used to call an Indian reserve, right? So I go, why can't you call yourself an Indian? She goes, well, because the Asians have hijacked the term. And I said, which Asians have hijacked the term? And she goes, the ones from India. And I said, Do you mean the Indians?
They're originally
Do you mean
called
the Indians
That
from
was-
India? And she
You were
goes,
wrongly misidentified as That's awesome.
It's so cute, isn't it? She's so sweet. Like she just, as soon as she saw it, she laughed. She's has really powerful humility. And she saw the humor immediately.
Yeah.
But the funny thing is that now we live in this world where, okay, I can say a word like salivate. You have a meaning about that. I can say a word like, I can say a word like, fresh steak off the barbecue. And there's some people in the population that would immediately begin to salivate, and there's other people that would want to vomit. And it's just because the meaning that they've created attached to that word. And I really mean this. I believe that people's happiness would be vastly improved if they would pay a little bit more attention to the meanings that they create about stuff, so that they were less offendable.
I really respect that perspective on offense. And that was really a beautiful share. Is there any last sort of wisdom you feel compelled to share before we dive out of this? Is there anything that,
Life's short, enjoy it. Just enjoy it. Not at all costs, not at the cost of others, but enjoy it holistically. Enjoy it in a way that supports our biosphere. Enjoy it in a way that supports the other human beings around you, and have fun, and wake up in the morning with abundant thoughts. I love what Lynn Twist said in The Soul of Money. And she says, if you wake up in the morning and your first thought is, I didn't get enough sleep, then your first thought was a lack thought, and that's going to set you up for lack vibration for the rest of the day. And I'm thinking, wake up in the morning and go, you know what? I am thrilled to be alive. I'm thrilled to have the friends that I have around me. I'm thrilled to have the opportunities I have around me. And I am absolutely thrilled to be alive. And then that's going to create that little belief that's going to look for evidence that there's a lot of abundance around you.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. My last question, and by no means my least question, beyond the name, beyond the businesses, beyond the speaking academy, beyond Wild Fit, beyond the skin suit, who are you?
I don't know. I'm just a guy traveling through the universe, having the best possible experience that I can.
I love you. So I just really want to take this last minute to thank you. For me, a big passion of mine is ontology. I'm a structural engineer and also a meditator. So it's all about inner space, outer space, and the curation and the dance between the two. So the ontology of storytelling, but also the health and the entrepreneurs, like the way you curate fundamentally, not just your message, but embed that in the context of your life. That is super powerful, brother. So thank you for all the work you do on yourself, you've done on your past, the messages that you're sharing now, and the work that will come in the future. I really respect that. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much for having me. I really value, I'll say this to you, and I don't mean this in any sort of platitude. I go through a bunch of different interviews, whether it's mainstream or podcast or what have you. And every now and again, I get to have a real conversation, where it's a chat and not a predetermined thing. And you have such a natural style of interviewing, so I really appreciate your style, and I really appreciate you bringing me here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. For those that want to get in touch with you, the easiest way to do that would be
eric.ee.
Yep.
www.eric.ee. I'm also on Instagram and Facebook under my name, and those are great ways.
Wicked, awesome. Thank you so much, brother.
Cheers.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to the Love of the Inspired Evolution and sharing the Love of the Inspired Evolution. If you feel like this content has supported you or may support anyone else that you know may resonate with the content of it, please share away and share the love around. Thank you guys so much. And to stay up to date on whatever's coming out with the Inspired Evolution, please subscribe. There's all these links in the bio for you to tune into the episodes and all these different platforms, just so the message can get to you and your loved ones. Thank you so much for all your love and support. Stay inspired to evolve.